Hi, welcome to Curious Hearts. This is a podcast about making meaning and finding purpose in the middle of a world on fire. I know that the world often feels overwhelming and it's really easy to lose sight of the things that actually matter to us. And having a place to come back to is essential for each of us to maintain our unique and personal connection to ourselves, to each other, and to something bigger than each of us. And also to stay true to our own path and our own purpose, despite everything that's happening around us. So, over the course of this podcast, we'll do a handful of things. We will explore what I think of as core spiritual principles and practices. I think of these as distilled from spiritual traditions, from yoga, from the Christian tradition, from the Sufi Muslim tradition, from my understandings of Hinduism as it comes through the yoga lineage, and then from various mystical traditions and non institutional spiritual traditions across the world, many of whom are indigenous or natural based. I think that having that as a framework, these spiritual principles as frameworks and ways for us to engage with the world and engage with ourselves are essential. But having principles without practices doesn't help. Just being up here in the knowledge of what we should be doing, or the things that we think, or the things that we think that we believe, are absolutely meaningless without the heart of practice. So, I'll also share with you some, again, distilled practices that I see across a variety of traditions. And certainly there are more than the ones that I will offer. And because of that, in addition to sharing some of those principles and teachings, I also will be interviewing people. We'll be talking to people from various traditions, whether they are already spiritual practitioners, whether they are teachers, philosophers, journalists, people who are trying to find and share the truth with others, their truth and what they consider a universal truth. And then also, we'll talk to everyday people just like you, people who find themselves on a path, find deep connected practices that bring them back to their centers and to themselves, but also who hopefully have some insight for each of us. And maybe more importantly, we'll understand the stories of when we get lost, when we find ourselves straying from our path, straying from the thing that connects us back to ourselves and each other and something bigger than us. And maybe we can see a little bit of ourselves in each other. And in each other's stories, we will cultivate a sense of compassion for how hard it is to be on this path, to be on a heart centered path in a world that is calling us away from that path all the time. And also, maybe we'll find little entry points, little introductions back into this place. So, first, I'll share a little bit about me and how I got here. My name is Vera Lester, and I live in New Orleans. I've lived in New Orleans almost my whole life, and that's important because New Orleans at its core is a deeply spiritual place. And I say that because a lot of the things about New Orleans don't make any sense. They do not work in a material world, and that can be very frustrating. But there also is a general sense in the air, in the water, in the way that we move in this city, that we choose things that don't always make sense materially, but that absolutely feel right in our spirits and in our souls. That's not to say that you probably haven't heard stories about people coming to New Orleans and, getting bourbon faced on Shit Street, and that's fine too. I think there are dark sides and dark corners in every spiritual journey. And this is a place that really understands that sometimes the most important thing you can do is laugh and celebrate and find joy and beauty in moments of devastation and great challenge. And New Orleans has taught me a lot about being a person in the world. my own personal journey in my individual life. I was not raised in a religion. I was not raised in church, really. I was not baptized, which is saying something when you live in New Orleans, which is in the middle of the Deep South. It is a very Catholic city. And as a result of that, growing up, I really became kind of a secular Catholic. When I went away for college, I realized how Southern I was and how important it was for me to have the calendar and the cycles of the Catholic tradition that I had grown up around, but not inside of. Mardi Gras obviously is a central part of that, but Mardi Gras is a celebration that comes right before Lent, which is an incredibly holy time in the Catholic and Christian tradition. So, although I didn't grow up in a church, I think I always was jealous of people who had deep spiritual traditions and deep religious traditions. I always wanted those things for myself, and I never quite found them. I remember reading the Bible on my own as a kid, and being really fascinated by other spiritual traditions, but I was always looking from the outside in. And it wasn't until after I graduated from college, I had my own series of pretty profound mental health crises from pushing myself incredibly hard as a type A, high achieving, um, gifted, smart kid who went off to a prestigious college, was trying to, make it, trying to do something. And every time I got myself to the pinnacles of achievement, and I did things that were apparently very impressive from the outside world, I found myself feeling kind of depressed once they were started or launched, and especially after they were finished. And I look back at that now and I know part of it is that I was so obsessed with the achievement of the thing that I had lost touch with what I really needed to be connected to. And we'll talk about that some. From a high level, that was about really appreciating every moment in the process, being able to celebrate and recognize my own contribution, and also being willing to rest as part of the holy creation cycle. It wasn't until Hurricane Katrina that I had the first of what I think of now as a spiritual awakening. I watched my entire city, the place I had lived my whole life, that honestly I still think about as a part of my family. I watched the whole city flood. I watched everything I knew be called into question and potential destruction in a very short course of time. And what that did is it absolutely shook the foundations of my faith that I didn't realize I had, actually. But I had faith that, one, the good guys always won. That in the moment when there is the greatest tragedy and struggle, that the the good things happen. And the moment that that was torn from me was watching the 17th Street Canal on TV, watching water pouring into the city, knowing how devastating that was. And, the good guys, heroes, flying in on their Black Hawk helicopters and dropping 2 tons of sandbags into that gaping hole of water rushing. And in my world, in my very Disney, very neat storytelling world, that would work. And we would all be saved, and we'd, go off and celebrate and hug each other, and, there would be joy in the streets. And that's not what happened. The sand and the human response to what was happening was no match for the power of water, and it didn't work. So that was my first crisis of faith. And my second crisis of faith was watching the government response to what was happening in my city in the hours and days after the immediate tragedy of the storm and the levee breach, but also throughout the following months, and seeing really how ill-equipped the government systems were to respond in the way that I needed, the way that we needed. So the faith I had had in the systems and government that I had participated in up until that moment, that I had, voted for and just believed that government systems worked and that my elected officials were operating in my best interest all the time, completely shaken to its core. And the last is probably one that comes from a deep childlike place inside of all of us, which is that my mom and dad could make everything okay. And they couldn't. Maybe not because they didn't want to, uh, but because they couldn't. That was not inside of their power or control. But these stories and institutions and people that I had put my faith into unconsciously up until that point were completely washed away, literally and figuratively. And because of my mental health struggle up until that point, because I was a person living with depression, pretty well managed when Katrina hit. I was 24 years old. I was doing okay in my everyday life. Um, but I had a very specific moment, and I remember lying in bed one night, falling asleep, and realizing that everything I had believed in up until that point didn't have the power I needed it to have. And if I was going to survive, if I was going to make it, I had to make a choice in that moment. And I did. I made the choice to believe in something bigger than me that I hadn't believed in until that moment. Because I knew if I didn't, I wasn't going to get through. And that's a very important part of my story because I've had a variation of that over and over again in my spiritual life and my spiritual practice. And maybe you have too, which is that um, I was highly competent. I was following a highly competent path. Things were going okay until they weren't. And everything I had tried up until that moment wasn't going to get me to the next path, wasn't going to carry me through. And it was only, as a dear friend of mine said, it was only when I was pulled to my knees that I really started to pray. So, honestly and openly, I did not come to a spiritual practice willingly. I did not come through my upbringing. I did not come through my cultural tradition. I came out of necessity to survive. And I think that that's why this podcast is so important right now in the moment that I'm living in the world that I'm living in not just politically, but environmentally, culturally, spiritually, economically. I think there have been these kinds of choice points in humanity's history over and over and over again. That's the good news. And the bad news is they suck. They're hard. And I don't think that relying entirely on a human world will get me through or get us through. And so that's what this podcast is about. This podcast is about a crying out from deep inside of each of us for something more, something bigger than us that can give us peace, that can give us hope, that can give us strength, that can reinvigorate our courage, that comforts us in moments of pain, and that we celebrate in deep moments of joy and collective affirmation. So that is what Curious Hearts is for and about. And I'm really grateful that you're here listening and watching. I am not a religious person, which maybe you've picked up on. Again, secular Catholic. I have been to Mass maybe 24 times in my entire life. I was never baptized, not as a child and never as an adult. I'm in my 40s. There is no one religious institution that I am willing to pledge my allegiance to. And I could have. When I had my major personal transition from a traditional worky work jobby job into whatever it is I do now, I almost went to get my master's of divinity, right? I almost meant to went to church school, and I chose not to because most of the options that were available to me required me to be Christian among all other choices. And I knew that that would be dishonest and disingenuous. And I made a commitment in that moment, and that was now more than 10 years ago, to build out my own training and practice as what I call a pastor for the spiritual but not religious. So, folks who believe in something bigger than themselves, who have an internal longing, a spiritual longing, a longing of essence, that heart's cry to be reunited, whatever words work for you. I I believe that there is a whole group of us who want something more, and we did not find it in cathedrals or churches and mass. We did not find it in basilicas or, you know, in traditional religious gathering places. And so that is the path I have been on, and the path that I'm inviting you to join me on. I think that there are misconceptions about spiritual practice, that it is woo woo, that it is not religious at all, that people who have a religious practice can't have a spiritual practice. I don't think that's true. I am not a religious person, but I don't care what you believe in your private personal heart. I think that the things that bring each of us a sense of connection, joy, awe, and peace are deeply personal, and that there are some core things that can guide each of us back there. So I will never prescribe for you what to believe. I will ask a lot of questions, and that really is what I believe is at the core of a spiritual practice. That it asks us really deep questions of ourselves and of the world as a way of helping to understand who we really are and why we're here, which is maybe one of the two most important questions we ask ourselves as human all day, every day. Who am I? And what am I doing here? How did I get here? And there is not a small jump then to the next question, which is, what the fuck do I do now? What next? Where do I go from here? Where do we go from here? So I will probably never give you any clear and pat answers. And sorry, but not sorry. Because I believe that anybody who answers those questions for you wants something from you, whether they know it or not. And they need you to think like them or believe in the same way that they believe in order for them to feel safe and at ease. And I really understand that desire, and I try to disinvest myself from that as often as possible. So, whatever you believe or don't believe, you're welcome here. And I am grateful for your presence, and I'm grateful for your attention. I I want to talk a little bit about why I named the podcast Curious Hearts. This is based on research and a lot of work and writing and exploration that I did, trying to find a name for the thing that calls each of us here. And I think both of these words are essential. And the first is about curiosity. Curiosity, at its very nature, approaches something with a sense of wonder and openness. Curiosity has is always asking the next question. And at its very nature, it is never satisfied. That can be one of the most challenging parts, I think, of a spiritual practice and a spiritual life, is that there is no final answer. There is only at the end of one question, there are 1,000 more questions. And I really appreciate the saying about like that we never get answers, but we learn to live into the questions. And so that is for me where curiosity leads me. I have never been disappointed when I approach a conversation, a person, or a concept with curiosity. And then our hearts, our physical hearts. Ugh, how fucking magical. Um, they're incredibly like twisted up, like Mobius like muscles that wrap in on each other. There are four extraordinary chambers that are both receiving and offering, right? And it's not just one, like they're reciprocal and they have a built-in backup. So I love that. It's a really extraordinary uh, design, engineering, technology, and it is incredibly reliable. The heart is un it does not need thinking. It does not need gratitude. It requires care and effort. It is in fact sustained by hard work. And the hardest thing on a heart is stillness all the time, right? Like sedation. We see this that like the best way to care for ourselves is to move our bodies. And that's because it makes our heart work harder. What an extraordinary thing. Like what other machine gets stronger the more it's worked? But there is also a spiritual heart, and it's, the place that we feel, when we fall in love, when we see something really heartwarming, heartbreaking, is like a sense of devastation, and it is a physical feeling of a spiritual and emotional experience. But in some of these traditions and the traditions that I practice, we often talk about the heart as the place we identify when we say, I am. No, that's me. We don't go, I am. That's I think. I am who I am, where I am, my true essence, my real being exists in this metaphorical spiritual experiential place. So everybody's got a hungry heart, deeply curious, always searching, wanting to work more and harder, and willing to do that up to and more than 100,000 times a day without being reminded and without being thanked. Like, what a fucking miracle. So, what I am inviting you into here is hard, consistent work that you will forget because I forget about my heart beating most of the time. And that I can always return back. We can always return back to this work and to these questions and to this deep searching hunger that I think is a callback to who we really are. So, I want to share with you now a little example of what we'll explore together. The first is what I think of as spiritual principles. And these are things that are touchstones and that can bring us back to that heart centered place, to that space of who am I and I amness. And based on my story, you might have already guessed that one of the things that I know for sure is that pain is unavoidable, that disappointment is not something we can opt out of. Suffering, in and of itself, I think is a call into this place. And so, in the moments when we feel the most troubled and the most heartbroken and the most even despairing, I think that those are not just deep calls into ourselves, they are reminders to come back. They are callbacks to this place in us that is hungry and curious and longing. But maybe even more importantly, our experience of pain and suffering is what calls us back to each other. Our experience of pain and suffering are what call us to each other. It's how we understand each other, it's how we connect really deeply to each other. And that, unfortunately, makes pain and suffering a tremendous gift. Sorry, not sorry. Um, I would never have been here. I would never be here. I would never be doing the work that I am doing and answering and asking these questions all day, every day, if I had not experienced bone chilling, heart wrenching sorrow that felt insurmountable. And without that, I would not have turned and been called. And that suffering to me is the call, is one of the ways that my experience of the divine rang me up, texted me out, was like, hey, friend, come here, come here, come closer. That's an example of a spiritual principle. And you're more than welcome to skip the episode on pain and suffering. That's totally fine. There are lots of other great ones like compassion and meaning making and our inherent enoughness, that we each have everything we need already. There is nothing that you need to make your way through this world and on this path that you don't already have. So hopefully there will be a little bit more inspiration and hope than there is twisty darkenness. But they're all part of this practice. They're all part of this path for me. So when it comes to practices open the door for us into exploring questions, exploring principles, and also beginning to live into the questions that we're coming up against all the time. Questions like, what the fuck do I do now? What is happening? Where do we go from here? The practices give us a structure and a foundation to take the next step forward. So, if you don't mind, I'm actually going to invite us to do that a little bit right now. We're going to start with the tiniest practice of listening. And you don't need to be doing anything other than you're doing. You don't need to be anywhere other than you are. But in this moment, we're just going to expand our ability to listen to everything that's around us and everything that's inside of us. So, wherever you are, just start with a breath. Maybe an inhale through your nose or your mouth, it doesn't matter. But listen to the sound of the breath as you receive it and then as you release it out again. Perhaps you do that a few more times, just listening to the sound of your breath on the outside and maybe even on the inside. And it's okay if you find other things that you hear in the space around you. Maybe you hear clocks ticking or the noise of traffic or people around you. You may notice a desire to want to tune that out and to focus in on something else, and that is a reasonable practice. But for now, I encourage you to just widen and soften your listening. Let the hums and the rattles in. Let the mess in, let the noise in, let the music in. Don't hold on to any of it. Just let it come in and out, just like the breath. Receiving and acknowledging, but not holding on. You may notice that the longer it goes on, the more sensitive you get, the more distant sounds you can hear. And without tuning out the widening of your listening and the more sensitivity to the external noise, I encourage you to also deepen your internal listening. So, just like you can hear your breath on the outside and the inside, maybe, maybe you can feel your pulse. You can hear the blood moving in your ears. Maybe you hear that high pitched sound that's there all the time, that inner whirring, that tone. Maybe you also hear messages, insight, intuition coming as flashes of words or sounds or memories or fantasies. All of these are listening practices. Listening allows us to grow more sensitive to our inner and outer worlds, to become more sensitive and less affected. Tremendous wisdom shared with me from a Buddhist teacher, that these practices over time make us more sensitive and less affected. So if we start with these apparently benign things like the sounds of the room around us, we just allow the sound to happen. We can receive more and more and more of it and be less thrashed about by our opinions, our attachment, our pulling towards us, our pushing away. So those are your examples of my personal and exploratory principles and practices. One of the principles and the practices that I think are essential is building a sense of community and connection with others. And so, in the spirit of that, I will just leave this with, if there are people, teachers, everyday people, monks or priests or writers or wisdom sharing folks who you'd like me to interview, please send me a message. Drop a comment in, if you're watching on YouTube, if you're on a podcast player, if you're in Spotify or Apple Podcasts, drop a comment, send me a message. You can always just reach out to me at hello@veralester.com. Also hello@curious-hearts.com. But wherever you are, I want to hear from you. And I want your questions, especially. I want the questions that are keeping you up at night. I want the questions that you're scared to ask in mixed company. I want you to be unafraid to open up to your own curious heart. And by sharing those things with me, we're building community. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for you. So, with that, I offer you deep blessings and peace to your own curious heart. And I'll talk to you next week. Take care, y'all. Blessings.